sons and your daughters, and bring them to me. And all the people took off their gold rings that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. This he took from them and cast in a mold and made it into a molten calf. And they exclaimed, "This is your God, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt." So several points are made in this narration. First, the people approach or gather against the word that's used in the Hebrew is al, and that word will become important a little bit later, but it's vayikahel ha'am al Aharon. So they approach Moses or gather against, Aaron, who Moses has left, as I mentioned earlier, in charge when he ascended Mount Sinai. Second point, what motivates them to make the request that they make of Aaron is that they're uncertain or they're anxious about what has happened to Moses. Third, Aaron responds, yields to their demand by telling them to collect the gold rings on the ears of their wives and children and bring these to him. So again, he says, collect the earrings or the rings on the ears of your wives and children. Fourth, the people take off their gold earrings and bring them to Aaron. And fifth, Aaron takes the gold from their hands and fashions a calf to which the people respond with a cry of joy, "This is your God, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt." All right, those are 5 points that reading the text together with me, we could all see. But the text is also full of ambiguities and raises an abundance of questions. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to take a moment to look at this text again by yourselves and consider, what are those ambiguities? What seems problematic? What doesn't make sense? What questions do you have? And then we'll remove this from the screen in a minute or two and gather together as a group to discuss that. So just take a look, just reread this to yourselves and say, and if you can do it in the Hebrew, that's even better. But either way, I think you'll pick up that some things just, if they make sense, but they may raise some questions as well. So not if you're ready to gather as a group. All right, so Tyler, can we get back as a group? Good. Okay, so what questions does this text raise for you? Are there things that you found ambiguous, problematic, unanswered? Yes, Tali, just remember to unmute yourself.
So there are 2 things that I noticed. One is that, as we know in Yitro, Moses has already gone up and down and up and down and up and down this mountain. This isn't a new thing to the people. And so it raises in me the question of, why are they anxious today? Why is this time the anxiety there? The second thing that strikes me is that Aaron collects all this gold. He doesn't say he's going to make an idol. He doesn't, in fact, say, "I have made an idol." That's the interpretation of the people. And so I wonder if that kind of takes some of the onus off of Aaron. Those are
So one question is about why the people are so anxious, and the other is about how responsible is Aaron here? Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, good. Others? Betsy, Glazer, just remember to unmute yourself.
Hi. I just thought of this for the first time, really, that as slaves they had they had gold, which I am interested in knowing economically how that was possible. I mean, what kind of culture was it? It never struck me before, but I guess it's because it was such an isolated passage that we read. That was something that occurs to me at this point.
It's a good question, and it's actually asked by the rabbis as well. And what the answer that's given is that was one of the things that God did for them as they left Egypt, is made sure that they were able to also collect all the gold of the Egyptians as they left. So this is what they brought with them.
Could you comment, is it the case that a calf was already sort of a prototype god from the extant culture, right?
Yes.
Is that the case? So that it wasn't such a leap that Aaron didn't declare the god, but he sort of aided and abetted the fact that they could then see a familiar object and declare it or interpret it as a god?
Yes, it's interesting because I thought you were going to take that in another direction, but absolutely, that it's quite possible that what came out or what he made, which also is not altogether clear, but that it was a recognizable God from the culture that they had just come out of, and so he didn't have to declare it as a god. I think that's a very good point. But one could also read that, I think, as the people wanting, that they came out of a culture, and that culture had certain kinds of elements to it, and that this wasn't necessarily a move against the God that took them out of Egypt. It was just a desire for something more tangible in the way that they knew from the land that they came from. So there's a reading of that actually can be, they didn't sin as much as we think they sinned. But let's go on. There are other things that are problems here. Fran, and then Judy. Fran, unmute yourself.
Yep. So what's ambiguous to me is who's doing the offering up of this gold. At first, I believe the men are being said, take it from your, I wish I had the text still in front of me, but I believe the men were being said, take from your wives and children. The next one was the people gave. So that is an offering from the self. It's not, there's no more intermediary. And then I think at the next sentence, it was taken, that Aaron took the gold. Again, I'm not sitting there, but when I read it, it felt like who has yielded up this offering or
Good.
what's taken.
Excellent. So those are all very good questions, and we're going to get to them in a few minutes. But let me just take, I saw Judy had her hand up, and Carol Glass, and then maybe we'll move on.
Yeah, this was the same point that I wanted to make, that it was the men who were commanded, who were encouraged, Aaron encouraged them to give, and then it sounds like all the people. So Vayit Parku. I mean, that's an interesting word, farek. Yeah, to separate. Yeah. So parak, I suppose, comes from the same word. It's separate. They separated themselves from their gold. It wasn't just they gave it.
Who's the they, Judy? Are you?
It sounds like it's Vayit Parku kol ha'am et mizmeh hazahav. That they were taking the gold that was in their own ears and brought it to Aaron. So it sounds like it's the women doing this voluntarily. It's one of those moments that I find myself feeling it's way too damning of the women. I don't want to find them guilty here.
Okay, we'll get back to that in a minute. There was Carol. Unmute yourself.
Yeah. I think I was going to just argue the opposite of Judy, that I think there are places where ha'am refers to men only. Judith's nodding, so I hope I'm right. Maybe when they're talking about people leaving Mitzrayim, they talk about am and they're counting the men only. So it could be understood that the men were instructed to take the jewelry off of the women, and then once the men had collected it all, then they had to part with it. And so they're the ones who actually gave it to Aaron. Again,
But you're suggesting that they still gave the women's jewelry to Aaron. Is that right?
I'm going by what without the text in
All
front
right,
of
we'll
me.
go back to the text in a minute. Let me just get Judy and then we'll go back to the text. Judith. Unmute yourself. We want to hear you.
Sorry. I just, on a somewhat different point, I wanted to, something that I find really strange and wonder what to make of is that both in the verse where the people say to Aaron, Aseh lanu Elohim asher yelchu lefanenu. It's translated as make us a God who will go before us. But the verb go is in the plural. And similarly, when Aaron has made the calf, the people say, Ela Elohecha Yisrael asher he'elucha me'eretz Mitzrayim, again using a verb in the plural.
Right, and of course Elohim itself could be.
It could be construed as a plural, but when it refers to Yud He Vav He, or God that we recognize as the God, our God, we always use a singular verb.
Right.
So what should we make of that? It's
right.
It's the people it's when in both cases we're quoting what the people themselves are saying.
Right. Okay. So let's put the text back up, and I apologize. I mean, I don't know how to see everybody and have the text in front of you at the same time.
I put a link to the source sheet in the chat. So if anyone wants to have it on a separate tab, they can open it up as well. But we'll just so people know. Okay, here we go.
Okay. So I am not going to be able to respond to all. Tyler, can we move it back down just so we have that first source? So there's no way of responding to all these questions tonight. And I'm really going to, and like the one, Judith, that you just raised, I'm not sure how that relates to the women. And since I want to focus on the women tonight, I'm going to put that aside and maybe we can come back to it at the end. But some of the other questions that were raised, and I'll add a few more. Some of the other questions that were raised, well, the big one is, who is this people? Who is the Am? It's mentioned several times, you'll notice. It's actually mentioned 3 times. The first 2 times it says Am, and the last time it says Kol Ha'am. All right. The people approach, the people, let's see, it's Vayar Ha'am, the people saw, and then Vayikahel Ha'am ala Haron, and the people gathered against or on Aaron. But then when it comes, and I think this is the point that Carol made, when it comes to the taking off of the rings, it says Vayit Parku Kol Ha'am, and all the people took off their earrings. Now, the problem there is if you look at verse 2, who is Aaron talking to?
The men.
He has to be talking to the men. Otherwise, it makes no sense to say, take off the earrings of your wives. I'm not in that culture anyway. It doesn't fly. So he's clearly talking to the men when he says that. But what's not clear is in the next verse, who in fact is taking the earrings off. Either the women were overhearing this somewhere, or they were, as we said, just bystanders, which would again be overhearing this. And as Carol Glass suggested, that maybe everybody was taking off their earrings, and the men brought it to Aaron. Or what's the third possibility? The third possibility is that it was just the men who took off their earrings, because they clearly, the women are not, if the women are not there in verse 2, then the women can't be there when they're taking off their earrings. or it would say the women took off their earrings. Anyway, we'll see how that plays itself out in the text. Aaron also tells the people to bring him, well, he tells the people to bring him the gold that they have removed. Do they follow his instructions or do they do something else? They clearly do something else, or it seems they do something else, or something is not spoken of and suddenly they're taking off their own earrings, or the people are taking off the gold from their ears. And finally, and this touches a little bit on what Judith Cates was raising, but not exactly, the people respond to the calf using the same phrase, "who brought you out of the land of Egypt," that they used to describe Moses in the first verse. In the first verse, it says, "For that man Moses, who brought us out of the land of Egypt." And it's the phrase, exactly the phrase which God spoke at the revelation, at the 10 Commandments. So what does this suggest about what's going on in the hearts and minds of the people? The text suggests that they're worried about Moses not coming down. And somebody mentioned that earlier, that why are they so nervous now? So when they say, "who brought us out of the land of Egypt," could this be some kind of clarion call for their rebellion against God? Or is it an expression of their confusion and panic about the kind of leader they need? Are they ready to be guided by an absent God, the God who revealed God's self at Revelation? Are they ready to be led by a mortal, Moses, who can disappoint, even possibly abandon them? They're not sure if he's going to come back, what happened to him, or will they only feel safe with a concrete, tangible image leading them through the wilderness? What is it that they want? And to get back to my original question, where are the women? Which is related to that question of who is the Am here? Who is the Am that's mentioned 3 times? Now, as I said, or as you notice, women are mentioned once in this section, and it's in verse 2. And how are they mentioned? As the wives from whose ears the people are to remove the gold earrings. But it appears from Aaron's directives that these people must be men, husbands and fathers. The next verse, as we've noticed, complicates matters and begins, "and all the people took off their rings." So why the sudden shift to all the people? And I think that's something that several of you picked up on. So now let's move to Rashi, to source number 2. Rashi, one of the most famous commentators writing in all time, but he was writing in 11th century France, comments on the mention of women, but not because he's particularly interested in women, or it doesn't seem like he's particularly interested in women, but really in an effort to explain why Aaron responds to the people as he does. Another question that we didn't mention, but that we could ask is, so the people make this demand from Aaron. Why doesn't he talk to them about it? Why doesn't he try to talk them down? Why doesn't he say, "don't worry, Moses is about to show up"? So this is the question that I think Rashi is trying to address. But he addresses it specifically on the phrase, "in the ears of your wives." And here's what Rashi says. Aaron said to himself, "Women and children have a love for their ornaments. Perhaps the matter will be delayed because they'll hesitate to give their ornaments. And in the meantime, Moses may arrive." They, the men, however, did not wait until the women and children made up their minds, but they took the ornaments off themselves. And then he quotes that passage. They took the pennants which were in their ears. There's no reference to the pennants belonging to the women. So in other words, he hears "in their ears" as in the men's ears. Rashi bases what he's saying on Midrash Tanhuma, and he's explaining that Aaron's instructions to the people are a way of buying time. He imagines Aaron thinking that if he could give the people a task that would take some time, Well, Moses might return before they had completed that task, and then we wouldn't have a problem. So why argue with the people if I could just give them something to do that will take them long enough so that the problem that they're having or the anxiety they're having will disappear. According to Rashi, Aaron chooses the particular strategy he does because he's counting on women's vanity and love, quote, love for their ornaments. Because the women would be loath to give up their gold, the men would have to spend considerable time trying to persuade them, or perhaps time forcing them to hand over their jewelry. Rashi's narrative suggests that the men did indeed follow Aaron's instructions and that they did approach their wives. And as Aaron anticipated, the women, true to character, or the character that Rashi thinks women have, hesitated. And they couldn't make up their minds as to whether to acquiesce. He doesn't say that they didn't give the jewelry or weren't willing. They haven't made up their minds. But the reason Aaron's strategy doesn't work is not because he misunderstood women, but because he wasn't attuned to the men's zeal and desperation. So what did the men do? Rather than waiting for their wives to agree to part with their gold, the men just took the ornaments off themselves. We have gold of our own. Why waste our time trying to persuade the women? Let's just give what we give. This is Rashi's reading. And Rashi concludes by quoting that verse in quoting verse 3, that they took the pendants or gold rings that were in their ears, and he emphasizes there is no reference to the pendants belonging to the women. So just to review again, here are some of the points that Rashi makes or implies. Aaron hopes to buy time and never intended to do anything with the jewelry he told the people to bring him. Second, the people who approach Aaron are men, impatient men who were unwilling to wait for their wives to decide. Third, the women, the people's wives, have trouble overcoming their attachment to their jewelry. Now, nothing is said about their resistance to what the men are up to. All we are told is that they love their ornaments and are likely to hesitate before parting with them. And the last thing we're told is that only the men contributed gold for the calf. So Rashi decides who contributed gold to the calf, but he doesn't tell us whether the women would have or wouldn't have. We just know that they're likely to hesitate. Now in source 3, we find a variation on the Midrash, and this is from Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, an Aggadic Midrashic work of the 8th or 9th century. As we read this Midrash, pay attention to how the women in this commentary are different from the women that Rashi described. After I finish reading the Midrash, we'll pause and screen share for a few minutes to discuss. Okay, so now I'm reading source 3. Aaron argued with himself, saying, if I say to Israel, give you to me gold and silver, they'll bring it immediately. But if I say to them, give you to me the earrings of your wives and your sons, forthwith the matter will fail. As it is said, and Aaron said to them, break off the golden rings. The women heard this, but they were unwilling to give their earrings to their husbands. But they said to them, you desire to make a graven image and a molten image without any power in it to deliver. The Holy One, blessed be, let's stop here actually. You desire to make a graven image and a molten image without any power to deliver. So let's gather together again for a minute and stop the screen share, and just if one or two people could say something about how the women in Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer sees the women differently than Rashi. Do you see that difference? Carol.
Well, there's a certain premise that I want to argue against in a minute, but the premise I think is that the women don't want to take off their jewelry because you know, they like jewelry and or vanity or something like that. But in this second case, they didn't want the men to take it, also because the men were going to do something that they thought was wrong with it. They were going to, you know, create an idol, and they didn't believe that they should do that. But I would, if I could, I just think that there might be a different reason why women would refuse to take off their jewelry that isn't quite so negative, which is that often jewelry is connected to who gave it to you or some kind of sentiment. And this is like one of the few things they have remaining with them from their life in Egypt. And even if Egypt was a bad experience, it might be that they got it from somebody in Egypt that they had a friendship with, or just that they wanted some way to stay connected to that experience.
That's nice, right?
So they weren't
Okay.
evil for not wanting
Yeah,
to take
you should. I mean, Rashi should have listened to you or heard you. I don't know, but Leah, is it Leah or Leah? And you need to unmute. Unmute yourself. We can't hear you.
Yeah, she's trying.
Ah, good.
Okay. So I have some problems with what Carol said, because it felt as if they got this jewelry at the last minute from their friends in Egypt, or took it. I'm not sure it would have a lot of sentimental value. But the other thing is, it feels like what the Midrash, the second Midrash, it's not really, it sounds like something that was written after the fact. You know, it's as if the women should know that that's what God is about. And I don't feel that women would have known that. They didn't even get the 10 Commandments yet.
Yes, they did. I mean, this is after Revelation and after they've heard the 10 Commandments.
Oh, they've heard, okay, so they've heard it, but I mean, the whole thing that we brought up before about the plural of God, to them, if you consider the culture they came from, there were many gods. And so for them, it might not have been such a big deal to have two gods, one they could see and one they couldn't see. So
if I'm understanding you right, Leah, that you're suggesting that the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer is somehow misunderstanding, or
Right.
It doesn't get what the woman could have possibly themselves understood at that moment.
That's what I think. That's what I think.
Anybody else before? Yeah, Sheila.
This is probably on the radical side, but it's always kind of bothered me when in Torah that we're often arguing on minute, like we did at the very first paragraph that we studied. Like it sounds like it's talking about all of them, and then it's just the men or whatever. And for anyone who has written a long report or a book, I mean, maybe they just didn't have good editors back then. And I often wonder this. We go into these long, and it's not up to me to question Rashi's interpretation, but you know, this all began because we can't quite tell, you know, the pronouns don't reflect back. There's like dangling pronouns, antecedents and stuff. And I just thought I'd throw that out there, that maybe someone just made a mistake and there was no one whoever was writing this section, there was no decent editor to kind of clean it up. So
it looked to me like Judy wants to respond to that. Is that right?
Well, not specifically to that, but I love that. I have to say, how interesting that we make a little big deal out of every little.
We do.
Yes, and that is one of the Jewish ways of reading text, and there's a lot of richness in that. But I was thinking actually that one of the challenges that I'm facing, sort of emotionally, in seeing these different takes on this, is that either the women are cast as very virtuous and, you know, oh, we don't want to give up our jewelry because it's going to be made into a golden idol, or they're seen otherwise as, I don't know what, either oblivious or they're cast as,
Vain, let's say vain or
vain. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah. And it feels to me a little bit like, it's not quite the Madonna whore kind of image, but it's a kind of either women are so virtuous or we're, we can't be seen just as people who have multiplicity, lots of different sides to us.
Right.
I'll move
Right.
again.
So I think that is one of the problems here. And I mean, I agree with you. And I think that's something we'll want to talk about more as we look at a couple more Midrashim. In answer to Sheila, I mean, it's not an answer, Sheila. I think it's an important question. I myself, as a student of literature, do always feel like every word matters. And if we have big questions, we might actually find the answers to those questions in these, in words that are ambiguous, in words that contradict earlier words, in something that's going on in the text itself. So yes, that is what, maybe I should have said that at the beginning, that my general mode of reading is to be as close a reader as possible and look at every word. There are other reasons that people look at every word. There are people for whom every word in this text is the word of God. And I would say that many of the actually Midrashists, the commentators, that is what they believe. And that's why they are determined to make sense of these contradictions or these ambiguities, because they feel there's no word in this text that could possibly be superfluous or unimportant or not telling us something that we might not realize right away.
Again, I know that's why Rashi's doing it. I'm just wondering why. I just thought I'd throw that in. I haven't ever heard anyone say it, like maybe there was a mistake, but I just know in Torah discussions.
No, I think it's an important thing to say. And
in Torah discussions, we all argue about the words. And it's like, wait a minute, guys, we're not Rashi. We think, I don't think we think God picked up Moses's hand or whoever and wrote down this. So anyway, I'll be quiet.
Okay, let me go to Leah and then we'll move on. Yes.
Well, to just state,
I think you froze.
what I mean, oh, sorry. To state the obvious, there's no female commentator. We have Rashi, we have source number 3, but there's no female saying what the women did.
Right, which is something that I think you're speaking to Carol and you're speaking to Judy. There are women today who are doing a lot of Midrash. And
I know, but I'm saying there.
Yes, you're right. Absolutely. But this is one of the reasons that women have to be doing the Midrash today, because it wasn't done then. So let's put the text back up and move forward, okay? Let me see. Well, let's stick with that one for a second, because I stopped just before it ended. I stopped just before what reward did he give them in this world? All right, this is still Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. And he goes on to say that they should observe the new moons more stringently than the men. And what reward will he give them in the world to come? They're destined to be renewed like new moons, as it is said, who satisfies the years by years with good things, so that thy youth is renewed like the eagle. All right, so this is in part where this idea of Rosh Chodesh as being a women's holiday comes from, that it was given to the women as a reward for what? For resisting to the blasphemous and irrational behavior of their husbands. What the women said to them was, you desire to make a graven image and a molten image without any power to deliver. It seems from this that they overheard the interchange between their husbands and Aaron, and they understand possibly their husbands' worries about continuing this journey in the desert without a leader. But what they also understand, even if they share the men's worries, is that making a graven image is a sin. They listened at Revelation. They heard what God said, that making the graven image is a sin, and that it's a folly or it's ridiculous to look up to a molten image that has no power to deliver. Who actually took us out of Egypt? Not any graven images. And that's partially what's being, what they're saying to their husbands. And as a reward, they're given Rosh Chodesh in this world. Now you may think that having to observe anything more stringently than the men is not much of a reward, unless you understand that what it means is that for women, Rosh Chodesh is a full holiday, a full day of rest, whereas for men, it's a half holiday. So they don't get to take the day off the way that women do. So the reward in this world, according to Pirkei Rabbi, to Rabbi Eliezer, is that they get Rosh Chodesh. And the reward in the next world is eternal youth. Now, there are many midrashim about that. That too is for another time. I want to keep the focus on women in this world, or more precisely, in the biblical world, and that world as refracted through midrash and commentary, not contemporary midrash, but medieval midrash. I see that I'm running out of time. So I may just keep going with the sources rather than stopping at this point. But what I want you to be thinking about is how convincing you actually find the midrashic claim that the women didn't participate in the production of the golden calf. And are you more likely, I mean, Judith raised this important point of either they're vain or they're totally righteous, but are you more likely to think of women as simply refraining or resisting, and why? Now, the rabbis have much more to say on this matter, though the context for their continued commentary on women and the golden calf is not in this parsha, but in the next parsha, which deals with the building of the Mishkan, or the tabernacle in the wilderness. Many midrashim and commentaries explore the relationship between the construction of the Mishkan and the episode of the golden calf. This evening, we're going to look at those commentaries that specifically address the question of where were the women. And let's take a look at the biblical text first, and that's source 4. And it begins, Vayikahel Moshe et kol adat b'nei Yisrael. Moses then gathered the whole Israelite community and said to them, it's Vayakel, and said to them, these are the things that the Lord has commanded you to do. I said Vayakel because it's significant that the opening clause in this parsha harks back to the opening words with the golden calf episode. There we read, Vayikahel ha'am al Aharon. The people gathered against their leader in locus parentis, Aaron. And here we read of the leader Moses gathering the people. So a world that was turned upside down in this week's parsha is set back aright in next week's parsha. Now, as we read the first verse, which I'll read again, pay attention to the language again, to each word. Vayakel Moshe et kol adat b'nei Yisrael, vayomer elehem ele hadvarim asher tziva Adonai lasot otam. Moses gathered the whole Israelite community and said to them, these are the things that the Lord has commanded you to do. Now, what I want you to notice is that it says, Vayakel Moshe et kol adat b'nei Yisrael. And somebody raised this earlier. I can't remember who. I think it might have been Judith, but I'm not sure. That there's a difference between Am and kol adat b'nei Yisrael. In the earlier chapter, in the earlier parsha, where we were reading about the episode of the golden calf, it said Am. Vayikahel Moshe ta'am. But here it says, Vayakel Moshe kol adat b'nei Yisrael. Is there a difference, and what might it imply? Now, one thing to say immediately is here it says kol right from the start. Whereas in the other one, as you remember, it said and then it said kol ha'am. Here we're talking about everybody. The phrase is repeated again in verse 4, where Moses invites the people to contribute to the construction of the Mishkan by donating gold and a whole bunch of other metals and materials, which are detailed in the next 13 verses, which we won't be reading. And that is in source 5, where it says, Moses said further to the whole community of Israelites, this is what the Lord has commanded. Take from among you gifts to the Lord. Everyone whose heart so moves him shall bring them gifts for the Lord, gold, silver, and copper. Now that so moves him is because when you the Hebrew, which is gendered, is always referring to the male. And that's why you have the him here, but I wouldn't take it as necessarily being just about men, and we'll see why in a minute. So we have 3 times, again in verse 20, it's going to say, it starts by Yetsu, Kol Adat B'nai Israel. So 3 times we repeat this phrase, Kol Adat B'nai Israel. And it parallels the 3 times that the phrase Am was repeated in the golden calf episode. So furthering the linguistic link between the production of the calf and the construction of the Mishkan that I already suggested was there through the use of Vayakel to begin this parsha. At the same time, the change from Am to Kol Adat B'nai Israel leads us to wonder if and how the demographics of the people, Ha'am, in the golden calf episode differ from the demographics of the whole community of the Israelites. In other words, what I'm saying is when a phrase is used like that and parallels the use of another phrase and does it over and over again, if you pay attention to language and care about the language in the text, it makes you ask why and what's going on here that's different than what was going on before. Now, the most powerful link between the 2 episodes, of course, is the request for donations, specifically donations of gold. And the outpouring of those donations begins in verse 21. And this is in source 6. And what does verse 21 say? I'm sorry, the outpouring begins in 21, but I'm going to skip to 22. Men and women, all whose hearts move them, all who would make an elevation offering of gold to the Lord came, bringing brooches, earrings, rings, and pendants, gold objects of all kinds. So what's clear in this text is precisely what was unclear in the earlier episode of the golden calf. The women are present, and that both women and men are engaged in donating their gold. It's very different than what we saw there, where some of you suggested that, yes, but it looks like the women were bringing their gold. It looks like when it says all the people took off their earrings, that the women are included, but the women aren't mentioned, whereas here the women are specifically mentioned. That said, this text is not without its problems. The translation that you have elides the difficulty of the very unusual Hebrew construction, which says, and I'll read in Hebrew first, Vayavo anashim al hanashim. The translation here says men and women. Well, it's a bad translation in many ways, so I'm not going to get into that. But hanashim al hanashim does not, somehow men and women doesn't get at what that phrase might mean. And we can only say might mean because it's a very unusual phrase. So some alternative translations might be the men on the women. Well, but what does that mean? The men against the women, that does hark back to the earlier chapter where the people gathered on Aaron or against Aaron. So there's some connection there. The men after the women, after might be like, or even with the women, if you say to somebody, come with me, right? The assumption is you're leading and the other person is coming with you. So the men on the women could be like the men with the women, the men following the women. Robert Alter translates it as the men besides the women. However we translate, this is exactly the kind of phrase that the commentators delight in exploring, especially if it allows them to elaborate on a point or a matter that they've addressed elsewhere, but they want to get back to again, or if it sheds light on a question that has not yet been satisfactorily answered. So I was going to look at 3 rabbinic commentaries. I don't know if we have the time to do that. Maybe maybe I'll go through it very quickly. How does that sound? What? You could all yell out no. All right, so let's go to, let's look at the Chizkuni very quickly. These are short, at least the first 2 are pretty short. So what Chizkuni does is he offers, or it's not a he here because it's a compilation, but 2 interpretations that are possible for the men came upon the women. One is to take away their jewelry in order to use them for building the tabernacle. A different interpretation is the with, the one that I just described, that the men did not volunteer their own jewelry as gifts for building the tabernacle until after the women had already done so by removing their own jewelry. So the 2 options that he offers us, they're rather different from one another. One is that the women withheld their jewelry, or the men had to aggressively get it because they didn't want to give it, though we're not told why they didn't want to give it. And the second is that the men didn't want to give their jewelry, and they had to see, the women had to kind of set the standard, and then the men followed. Now, in the next source, what we'll see is that, again, 2 possible ways of reading the men up on the women come up. But unlike the source we just looked at in the Chizkuni, the Kli Yakar wants to reconcile these sources, and to do so develops a somewhat complex narrative to reconcile them. And I think you'll be interested in this. And the commentators said that it means with the women, to declare the righteousness of the women who agreed to give their jewelry. And it should be said that this is genuine praise for them, because according to the law, they didn't have to give their jewelry. Now that's a whole new thing. Why didn't they have to give their jewelry? We're talking now about for the building of the Mishkan. They didn't have to give their jewelry because it was the men who had removed their own rings and made from them the calf. And therefore, they had to contribute their own gold for the Mishkan to atone for their sin. So what Kli Yakar is seeing is the building of the Mishkan is directly related to the golden calf, and it's a way for them to make atonement for what happened at the golden calf. And the only people who have to make atonement are those who actually participated, and that was the men. This is why, this is how the Kli Yakar is explaining this. And he goes on to say, or it goes on to say, nevertheless, that the women refused to give their jewelry because they didn't need to atone. Nevertheless, due to their great affection for the holy, the Mishkan, the women did not refrain from giving. So even though they didn't have to, they were willing to give. But they did not want to bring the donations in their own hands to Moses, lest he think that they had a part in the sin of the golden calf. This is a rather complex idea, right? They don't have to give their jewelry because they don't have to atone, but they want to give their jewelry. But they're reluctant to give their jewelry because if they do, Moses might think that they're actually acknowledging that they did have a part in the sin of the golden calf. As it says, every generous heart shall bring, but the women didn't bring, they gave their jewelry. So they gave it to the men who brought it. And that's how Kli Yakar explains al hanashim. And yet because it says al hanashim and not im hanashim, on the women, not with the women, a plausible reading is that the men came upon the women with great force, all right? Because the women didn't want to donate their gold for fear that people would say they had a part in the gold of the calf. So the way that on the women is being understood, again, it's an act of aggression. It's an act of aggression on the part of the men. Why? Because the women are withholding. And why are the women withholding? Not because they're vain, but because they're worried that they'll be misunderstood. And so the men have to force it out of their hands. And now we get to the last of these midrashim, which I hope you'll find interesting. And this is source 9. The men came, this source is Das Kenim. It's a compilation of Torah commentary by French and German rabbis of the 12th and 13th century. And they read the men came upon the women, and the men came to the women intending to deny them to offer their jewelry. All right, so the men didn't want the women to give. However, the women were quite anxious to donate even these pieces of jewelry, seeing that it was for a holy purpose. This is why the Torah gives them special credit for their general attitude. According to our sages, this is the reason they were given, and we heard this before, a holiday of Rosh Chodesh by being allowed to treat it as a sort of holiday, etc. This was also in recognition of the fact that they had refused to part with their jewelry in the early episode. So what we had read earlier was that women were given Rosh Chodesh because they refused to give their jewelry to the building of the golden calf, or did not participate in the building of the golden calf. Here we're told that the women didn't give their jewelry. Here we're told that they were anxious to give their jewelry. It's just the opposite. Here they really want to give their jewelry. And this too is why they're given the holiday of Rosh Chodesh as a gift. So what interests me here is that what is being said by Das Kenim is that in these last episodes, the final episodes of the book of Exodus, women refuse to give their gold for the golden calf, and then are very eager to give their gold for the building of the Mishkan. And so they withhold in the one case, and they are absolutely generous in the other case. And for both of these reasons, they are given the holiday of Rosh Chodesh as a reward. Now, other midrashim, which we don't have time to look at tonight, make even more extravagant claims about women's righteousness and their rewards. There's some midrashim that talk about how all the men die in the wilderness, but the women get to enter the land as a result of their non-participation and their generosity. What I find most striking, and I guess this was already raised, I think by Judy, what I find most striking is how different rabbis over many centuries in different parts of the world share this understanding of women of the Exodus as from beginning to end, exemplary, courageous, devoted, and ever faithful to God. Rashi has the bit about their vanity, but that gets abandoned pretty quickly. So I really wanted to end, and if you have a few minutes to stay and talk about this, I'd love to hear what people think. I wanted to think about where this wholesale glorification of women of the Exodus leaves us. Do we gain strength from such interpretations? Do we feel challenged by them? Do we learn something about moral courage from them? Or do we find them confining and dangerous? Does anybody want to speak to that? Leah, and then Judy, I guess. Yeah, but you have to unmute.
Back to your question, you know, there are historians who say that things that are in a certain order that we read them are not the real order. And that's why I kind of in my mind said before they didn't know yet what was in the 10 Commandments. And I'd rather think that. I'd rather think that the women hadn't heard the 10 Commandments yet, even though they're already written down there, and that helps to explain some of their behavior, for what it's worth.
Okay. Judy, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I find this confining, I will say. I mean, it feels like we're being seen in two dimensions, and that this is all through the perspective of men. This is Torah text through the perspective of men, and then the commentaries through the perspective of men, who for some reason seem to want, at least in these settings, to cast us in two-dimensional terms. Without looking at the whole human, they must have known lots of women. These must have been straight men who I'm assuming were married to women. And still there's a sense of a mystery here that, they have to cast women either as this or as that without being able to see us as fully formed and, having lots of facets anyway, is what I keep thinking of. That sometimes we may be virtuous, and at other times the same human being, the same female human being might not be so virtuous. So to be cast in this way just does feel very confining. That's a perfect word for it.
Yeah, and I might add to that this, we should also, though we haven't looked at the whole text, but this is in a parsha where we are really seeing a multidimensional Moses in terms of the way he reacts. And somebody whose imperfections are what make him attractive to us in some ways, right? It's the imperfections of the women of Genesis that draw us to them. And yet here, what's done is perhaps a real whitewashing or an either or. Any other thoughts about that? Yeah, Judith, and then Betsy.
Well, both what we've wonderfully presented and the people's comments are making me wonder whether, in fact, within the biblical text, if not in the commentaries, which seem to need to take an either or version of women, which is bothering so many people. I'm wondering whether what we are seeing is within the biblical text from the golden calf episode to the text of the building of the Mishkan, that there's a notion of development, of inner development on the part of women, that women themselves have learned from the deep problematics of their original responses, how they were so ambiguous. We're not sure exactly what they were, but that possibility of their participation in the golden calf in one way or another, but that when we arrive at the end of Exodus with the building of the Mishkan, they are they're clear about where they want their actions and their allegiances to go, which is toward holiness, toward finding a different way of embodying their desire for a sense of God's presence among them.
Beauty.
That's beautiful, and maybe also towards the whole community, being part of the whole community of Israel and participating fully in it, and that's part of that change. So this is why we need women's Midrash now, right? I mean, that is what Judy just offered us. Betsy, you wanted to say something, but you have to unmute. Unmute.
Okay, thank you. I did just post in the chat how I still find an overarching issue here with how the jewelry was obtained as being problematic, in that there is so many issues about ownership and who will give and who won't. And I am an earring addict, but it's like I buy my own, and I'm working on not buying my own, not buying any actually at this point. But that to me, that is a serious problem. And it also harks back to the fact that another problem in Exodus is that Miriam dies and from a disease. And I find that also very disturbing, that God would have permitted that to happen. It's yeah, it's really painful for me to be reading this.
Mm-hmm. I think your comment about earrings, I mean, I love earrings too, but that wasn't what I was going to respond to. I think it does hark back to something that Carol Glass said earlier also about earrings having a value for women that isn't addressed in any of these midrashim either. Judy. Just unmute. Yeah.
I'm looking along as we're studying. I'm looking at the Women's Torah commentary, and two odd little points here. There are only 6 times in Exodus that the word nashim appears.
Right.
Odd little interesting moment, and also that there's a sense of women having agency here, women having some control. It says that women owned valuables and could make decisions independently of their husbands or fathers about using them as donations. So yes, there may be some emotional valence, some emotional connection to the valuables, whether they were, I don't know, looted from Egypt or given as gifts or received or whatever. The fact of women here being able to make their own decisions about the disposition of their property does seem kind of significant in some ways.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, Tyler.
I completely agree with some of the comments that Judy made before. I'm also just noticing, I'm feeling these texts are making me feel hopeful. I'm noticing both in the text about women's vanity and also in women's resistance. Both texts are about resistance, either Aaron trying to figure out a way to slow down the construction of the calf, or the women trying to slow down the construction of the calf. And it just seems like the rabbis are trying desperately to grab on to some form of resistance within the community. And I just find that very, now it failed, the calf was made because those voices were marginalized. And it gives me some hope that if we can lift, that they're looking for those voices, and that if we can continue to lift up those voices, that we have a responsibility to make sure that resistance is heard.
Yep. Lovely. Leah. You have to unmute.
So, yeah. I feel we have to go outside the issue of women. I can't help it, because I just feel that we're making so many assumptions about what these people believe. They just got out of Egypt. They were slaves. There were different gods there. And we're making so much out of this calf even. It feels like it doesn't make sense. All of a sudden people are religious about God. You know, this is what the people who wrote the Torah wanted us to feel. But I can't believe that people who are just merely out of slavery, nearly got away with their lives, that they're thinking the way we're thinking at all. So that's my problem with this whole part.
Fran, did you want to address that or ask a different question or? Okay. Fran's telling me that Lee, I don't know if I want to end on that note.
Well, the Thunder and Lightning show of Revelation might have.
I
moved
know,
them
I'm
a little
sorry,
bit as
I'm
well.
sorry. I didn't want to end on a negative note, but I see too much of the hand of man in this rather than the hand of God.
Well, the thing is, the text is there for us. It's our hand that is interpreting it. It's our minds, it's our hearts. So what we bring to it, I think, opens it up in ways that I think Judith did beautifully for us earlier. Judy also, I think that if we bring our understanding of what it is to be a woman to this text and question the text based on that understanding, then there will be a dialogue between us and what might feel like a text that has nothing to do with us. But I think in the end, we discover that maybe it does. And maybe that is where I will leave it. And thank you all for really wonderful participation and helping us expand what I was thinking. And I look forward to future times to do this together again.
Great.
Thank you, Tyler, for working the.
Thank you so much, Gail. This was wonderful. And I just encourage people to look at the schedule for the rest of the week. No boring moments. Tomorrow is a program led by Rebecca Mountner and the Megillah as a mirror, power dynamics between women and men in everyday life. Talking about kind of a follow-up from what she started to talk about on Purim. So, and then so many more things over Shabbat. So we just continue the learning, but this was so wonderful. And I'm looking forward to carrying all these ideas into Shabbat. So thank you so much.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.
Thank you so much, Gail.
Thank you.
This was wonderful. Thank you.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.
Okay.